Hi everyone, I see that we're getting a very full attendance room here. I'd like to welcome everyone to the International Water Resources Association webinar on environmental flows. We're going to go ahead and get started in just 1 or 2 minutes, so I'll give everyone a chance to get a chance for a last cup of coffee if it's the morning or evening for you, and a glass of water or whatever is appropriate for the hour that you're at. Go ahead and get your notebooks and get ready. We'll be starting in just 1 or 2 minutes. Hi everyone, welcome to the International Water Resources Association webinar. I think we're about 3 minutes past the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started here just right now. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us here at the International Water Resources Association. We're doing environmental flows of the harmony between humans and nature this month as our webinar. And our really great panelists include Michael McCain, Chair Professor of Eco-Hydrology at the IEG Delft Institute for Water Education, Rebecca Thame, the Director of River Futures and a Fellow at LE Stadium, David Thickner, Chief Freshwater Advisor at the WWF, Jiang Qiu, Professor of Engineering, China Institute of Water Resources and Hydropower Research, and Jiadong Zhao, Deputy Division Chief, General Institute for Hydropower and Water Resources Planning and Design, Ministry of Water Resources of the People's Republic of China. So just to remind everybody that this is a webinar hosted by the International Water Resources Association. The IWRA is an international network of researchers and practitioners who work on a multidisciplinary range of water resource issues. We are a non-profit, non-governmental and educational organization. The IWRA provides a global knowledge-based forum for bridging disciplines and geographies by connecting professionals, students, individuals, corporations, institutions, everyone who's concerned with sustainable use of the world's water resources. So we're really happy to have everyone with you here today. We have a great, very large audience today, and so we're happy to see that. We have a really great panel. I think people who are both practitioners, researchers, people who bring a lot of different experiences to this group. So just to remind everyone that our panel today, we're going to talk about environmental flows. And so whether that is water provided within a river, a wetland, or a coastal zone, there's really important reasons to maintain the ecosystems and the benefits that they bring to us with the competing water uses and depending on how water is being regulated. So environmental flows become a tool for allocating water among multiple competing uses within a watershed or river basin, and to build consensus around allocation decisions. And our panel today is going to discuss those flows in different contexts and geographic areas. So I'm just going to briefly explain the format of today's webinar. This will become same as usual, but just to remind everyone, each of our presenters will have a short presentation, and then at the end we're going to have time for audience questions from you. So you can see on your GoToWebinar control panel, there's a section for questions. You can go ahead and type in your question, and it'll go right to our moderator, David Tickner. And he can assign it and pose it at the appropriate time at the end of the panel questions. So if you can pose your question at any time, right now, as soon as you hear a presentation that's quite interesting to you, or at the end of all the presentations. And we do ask you to understand we may not be able to all the questions, given that we have not the longest amount of time we can be here to get together. I'm sure we could talk all day if we wanted to, but kind of limited. We'll hopefully get to as many as we can, and we're going to have a great event. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn the floor over to my moderator, David Tickner, Freshwater Advisor from the WWF. David, I believe you were the first speaker as well as the moderator. So Thank you.
Good. Thanks, Scott. I hope everybody can hear me okay. I hope everybody can see okay as well. Just a reminder to fellow panelists to keep themselves on mute, at least until it's their turn to speak. I also just wanted to say thanks to IWRA for arranging this. I think it's a really interesting and important time for environmental flows globally. So this is a very timely session. I think maybe just in the interest of time, we'll move straight on. I'll give the first presentation and then we'll be handing over to subsequent speakers. So Scott, do you want to enable me to show my screen? Great. And hopefully if I press that and that. Now, can everybody see my slides? Scott, can you see them?
Just making it full screen here. It's still in the not full screen mode. There we go.
Is that
Perfect.
okay?
That looks good.
I'm actually still, I should be starting here. So it's a very interesting time for environmental flows, and the purpose of my presentation is to really share some insights from a range of work that WWF has done with a wide range of partners in recent years in various different parts of the world and at the global level. And the focus of our work is very much on trying to encourage implementation of environmental flows. So moving beyond a research agenda into mainstreaming environmental flows within water management. And I very much hope what I say dovetails very neatly with what the other speakers will say as well. Just in terms of broad context first, I think, well, we'll recognize this. We're living at a time of multiple different crises in the planet. It's very easy to dwell on all of those. Of course, we have the COVID crisis, which has added a significant new layer to what all of us are doing. Leaving that to one side for a moment, at WWF, we're really focusing on what we call the triple challenge. And the triple challenge is really focusing on how do we meet the individual challenges of improving lives for 10 billion people who are going to be living on the planet in the coming decades, tackling climate change, and restoring nature, which is much depleted in many parts of the world, with all sorts of consequences. These individual challenges are interrelated, and our responses to them are interrelated. So what we do to tackle climate change can affect the way we use nature, for example. Obviously, the development choices which affect people's lives affect both nature and climate change. So there are some potential synergies around that. There are also some real trade-offs. And I think we see this when we're thinking about water management. Using water for the environment is sometimes posed as a rival water use to using water for economic development, for example. We know that climate change affects rainfall and river runoff, precipitation patterns globally, so it's posing new challenges for water management. A particular crisis that WWF is concerned about is the decline in nature. And we express this typically through something called the Living Planet Index, which, if you like, is a stock market for wildlife populations across the planet. And the diagram I'm showing here is the Freshwater Living Planet Index. So this shows the decline in populations of vertebrate animals living in freshwater environments since 1970, which is about the earliest we can get reliable data. And as you can see, since about 1970, and I was born just a little before that, that stock market has dropped by more than 80%. So as a little thought experiment, you could ask yourself what the governments and business leaders of the world would do if the Dow Jones or the FTSE 100 stock markets had dropped by 80% over a sustained period. You can bet your bottom dollar that they would be taking concerted action to address that. And it's similar concerted action that we need if we're going to address this kind of crisis. Now, I framed this as crises and opportunities. There's an old proverb that you should never waste a good crisis. It's a good chance to get things done, to change the way the world approaches problems. And we are beginning to see signs in the international discourse that these interrelated crises of climate, of improving people's lives, of biodiversity decline, perhaps of human health now, especially as a result of the COVID crisis. People are beginning to think that perhaps there is a different way we should be approaching development challenges. And we're beginning to see this as well because in the next year or so, there are going to be several major international meetings focused on the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and a few other international mechanisms as well, which really present an opportunity to reboot the way the world approaches natural resource management, including the way the world thinks about water management. Partly to inform those opportunities, WWF has convened a number of experts. I'm very happy that Rebecca Tharn and Mike McLean were among them, to think about, well, if we wanted to address in particular that downward decline in freshwater biodiversity, that very steep decline, what is it that we need to do? And earlier this year, we published a paper in Bioscience called Bending the Freshwater Biodiversity Curve. And we set out what we called an emergency recovery plan to do that. The emergency recovery plan was really a 6-point plan. And this graphic shows the 6 points. And you'll see that highlighted is point number 1, which is implement environmental flows, essentially. That doesn't, because it was number 1, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the most important thing we could do. These things will often be context dependent, and often we'll need to implement several of these solutions to make the kind of change that we want to see. And they can be synergistic changes. But nevertheless, environmental flows are central to improving the status of biodiversity, and I would argue also to improve the way we tackle several central water management challenges in the 21st century. It's important to say that this emergency recovery plan wasn't based just on research or theory. We actually based all of our recommendations on solutions that have already been implemented somewhere in the world. I'll move on now to describe some of those. Back in 2017, WWF commissioned a piece of work called Listen to the River. The idea of this was really to take a look at success stories in environmental flows from around the world and to try to extract some lessons that could be of wider use. So we wanted to see not just where policies had changed or where there'd been some really interesting and exciting environmental flow assessments done. We actually wanted to study cases where there was water in the river as a result of concerted efforts to implement environmental flows. We took a close look at 8 different case studies scattered across the globe in a range of political, cultural, development contexts. And out of that, we generated a number of recommendations for people, water management practitioners, conservationists, and others who were interested in trying to pursue environmental flow implementation as part of water management efforts. The diagram on the right here, which I won't dwell on in too much detail, tells you in summary about what those recommendations were. Around about the same time, a couple of other initiatives happened. Angela Arthington and others convened a bunch of the great and the good environmental flow practitioners from around the world to refresh the Brisbane Declaration on environmental flows. The Brisbane Declaration was originally published in 2007, and it really sought to act as a bit of a rallying call to try to make the case for environmental flows and to set out an agenda for environmental flow implementation. In 2017, during the International River Symposium held again in Brisbane, we deliberately set out to refresh that declaration 10 years on, to try to encapsulate lessons that a number of us had learned in the intervening years. And the new Brisbane Declaration paper, which was published in 2018, I think does a very good job of summarizing everything we've learned about implementing environmental flows and of setting out a global action agenda for their implementation. along with Rebecca Tharm and a couple of other colleagues, Nitin Kaushal from India and Robert Speed from Australia. I also helped edit a research topic, if you like, a special issue of the journal Frontiers in Environmental Science, which tried to delve into a little bit more detail into some of the research, some of the case studies that have looked into the challenges and the opportunities for environmental flow implementation. All of these things, along with WWF's programs in countries as diverse as Mexico and Tanzania and India and China, have informed a few insights that I'd like to share with you that I think could really help in efforts to get environmental flows implemented. So insight number one, I think those of us who are advocating for environmental flows as a means of addressing environmental biodiversity challenges, but also as a means of achieving better use of ecosystems for human development as well. I think in the past we've been a little bit guilty of seeing environmental flows a little bit in isolation of wider water and river basin planning processes. So for me, the first insight I'd like to share is that really anybody interested in environmental flows has to understand where environmental flow assessment in particular fits within those broader processes. This diagram here sets out an archetypal water allocation planning process. It's actually drawn from a piece of work that WWF did with colleagues in China in the IWP, which Dr. Zhao, who will speak later, was a part of. And what you can see here is that environmental flow assessment is really only one part of the first stage of a typical water allocation planning process. And I think it's very important, if you're advocating for environmental flows, to understand that whole process, the mechanisms behind it, the political considerations which underpin it, and also linking to my second insight, what it is decision makers are trying to get out of water allocation planning processes. Now, sometimes in some contexts, decision makers are genuinely concerned for the fate of biodiversity. They're genuinely concerned for environmental health, for the health of our rivers and lakes and wetlands. And that's great and should be encouraged. And I would argue we need more of that. But in many contexts, environmental considerations are very much secondary when it comes to real life. And decision makers in government or in business or in communities are actually much more concerned with achieving sometimes quite short-term, sometimes medium-term socioeconomic development priorities. And so really, if you're advocating for environmental flows, trying to understand how environmental flows can support what I would call strategic ecosystem services that can in turn support those social and economic development goals, I think is absolutely critical. So understanding when to make the case for the environment and when to make the case for the environment as a supporting mechanism for social and economic development is a really key tactical consideration. Moving on, and in particular here, I'm indebted to Professor J. O'Keefe, the late Professor J. O'Keefe from Rhodes University in South Africa, who was one of the founding fathers of the environmental flow movement and influenced many of us in the freshwater conservation community. He coined the phrase hot moments, moments in time when decision makers, stakeholders take a look at the way we manage water, the way we manage freshwater ecosystems, and say, this isn't right, we have to do something differently. Sometimes those hot moments can arise as a result of disasters, major droughts or major floods, for example. Sometimes they can arise, and we've seen that in Australia, for example. Sometimes they can result as an outcome of major political change. South Africa, perhaps, is a good example of that, where the end of apartheid in the early 90s saw a significant change in political governance, and that provided an opportunity for new approaches to water management, which in turn provided an opportunity to think about environmental flows. Sometimes these hot moments or trigger moments can arise as a result of perhaps slower, more gradual changes in the way society and decision makers view the environment. And I'd argue maybe we're seeing that in places like China at the moment, where the rise of a new middle class who are concerned about the health of the environment, about air quality, about water quality, has perhaps led to greater consideration of things like environmental flows as a central plank of water management. Just as there are hot moments in time, sometimes there are what I would call hot people, people who can make things happen. O'Keefe called these champions, other people have called them policy entrepreneurs. There are different phrases out there. I think in any attempt to influence water management, including to get environmental flows implemented, understanding who the champions are and how to harness their efforts and support their efforts to influence environmental flows is proven really important in a number of the case studies that we've looked at. Sometimes these champions can be within NGOs. One of the case studies we looked at in Mexico, a colleague of mine from WWF, was a real champion to get the environmental flows conversation going in Mexico. Subsequently, he was joined by a champion from CONAGUA, from the National Water Management Agency in Mexico, who was able to champion perhaps at a higher level within government the case for environmental flows. Sometimes these champions can be from the research community, they can be from the business community. If we look at the recent examples from climate change, school children can be champions who can take the conversation to a different level, people like Greta Thunberg, for example. So it almost doesn't matter who these champions are, where they come from. What matters is recognizing when somebody is in that position and really working with them to support the agenda. Insight number 5 is really about understanding the enabling factors that can guide the details of e-flow implementation efforts. So let's say that there has been a hot moment, and let's say that a champion has said, no, we have to do things differently around water management and every chance to improve the health of our freshwater ecosystems for all of our benefit. Environmental flows is a key part of that. What exactly do you do to enable implementation of environmental flows? And here the work we did in our Listen to the River report, I think, is particularly insightful. From the 8 case studies that we looked at, we really crystallized 8 different enabling factors, which you can see on the screen before you. Now, the exact makeup of those enabling factors looks different from place to place. As I mentioned, in Mexico, having a champion was particularly important. In one of the case studies we looked at in my country, in the UK, actually a switch in legislation was a particularly important enabling factor, with some other enabling factors also being of secondary importance. So it's not a question of having all of these things in place everywhere. It is a question of understanding which are the key enabling factors which need to be in place in your particular context, and then trying to figure out, well, how do you put those enabling factors in place, working in partnership with a wide range of stakeholders as necessary. Lastly, insight number 6, environmental flow assessments, which is perhaps the more scientific end of environmental flow implementation. These are absolutely vital to ensure that we're doing the right thing. There are some very, very sophisticated tools for environmental flow assessments now. Over the last 20 years, I think the water research community, including people like Mike, Rebecca, and others, have made huge strides on this. And we're almost spoilt for choice in terms of environmental flow assessment methodologies. The key thing is to make sure you're picking the right methodology for your context. And in many contexts, actually simple is good. So the reason why I've got a photo of Albert Einstein up here is because one of my favorite aphorisms is often attributed to him. He said, make things as simple as possible, but no more simple than that. So there may be some degree of complexity necessary, but sometimes you really can keep things quite simple. Mike McLean might want to say more about this, but the photo of the wildebeest there, this is taken from the Mara River, which links Kenya and Tanzania. WWF has been working with partners to try to safeguard environmental flows through water allocation planning in the Mara for a number of years now. And although there are layers of complexity underneath that, essentially the key challenge from an ecosystem perspective is making sure that there are dry season flows continuing along that river through the Masai Mara Serengeti ecosystem, which is where this iconic photo of wildebeest crossing the river and dodging crocodiles was taken. It almost doesn't matter exactly what the flow regime is, the exact number of cubic meters per second you need flowing down the river, providing there is a reasonable amount of flow through the Masai Mara Serengeti system. That may well be good enough. And it may well be, at least for the political arguments around environmental flow implementation in that context, you don't need to be any more complicated than that. So that's just one example of how sometimes you can distill environmental flow implementation down to some really very simple and easy to understand objectives, even if some of the assessment underneath might need to be a little more complex. That's all I wanted to say. I hope those insights have been useful. I'll leave you with this quote about listening to the river from the American writer Edward Abbey, which I often return to. I find it quite inspiring. Thank you for listening. I think, putting on my moderator hat now, and if Scott can press the right buttons, I think now I'm going to hand over to Rebecca.
Rebecca, you should see it there. Looks good.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Scott. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you for this interactive webinar on environmental flows. I will introduce some of the social cultural aspects that are considered important contributors to a stronger framing for environmental flow processes along the lines that Dave has started to outline, and which will facilitate more effective implementation in a way that increases the benefits for people and nature. Environmental flows are a scientifically robust approach within integrated water resources management for maintaining ecosystem health and meeting the needs of the people who most directly depend on these systems daily, ensuring more resilient water systems for the future. An understanding of social cultural context is important when determining the quality, timing, and quantity of freshwater flows that are necessary to sustain aquatic ecosystems. Such knowledge is also important to ascertain the ways in which these same flows and levels also benefit human cultures, economies, sustainable livelihoods, and well-being. The environmental flow implementation challenge that Dave has highlighted has focused considerably greater attention on the need for a stronger social cultural framing for environmental flow assessment to help overcome obstacles such as institutional barriers and conflicts of interest, and to support those key areas that are common to many of the assessments, and I've highlighted some of those here in the social decision context. An environmental flow assessment is essentially a social process informed by the policy context, stakeholder interests, best available science, whether that's biophysical and social sciences or traditional knowledge, and best management practices. Considerable attention is being given to the science for determining flows and on developing the assessment methods, as Dave mentioned, and to a more limited extent on the adaptive management approaches that are effective on the ground for actually allocating environmental water, as Michael will go on to discuss. The social decision context within which every individual environmental flow process is situated is equally important to understand, but it's seldom an explicit focus. This lack of a commensurate level of effort to understand the different elements that make up this context is despite their potential to act either as enabling factors that constructively direct the process or disruptors to that process. I'll use the case of Tanzania in East Africa to highlight some of the social cultural considerations that are being found to be important in achieving implementation. Tanzania is a country in development that is currently highly active and engaged in the field of environmental flows and faces challenges to sustainability that are common to many other places in the world. 10% of the country is covered by rivers, lakes, and wetlands. Many of them are of exceptional biodiversity, and many are in degrading condition. This includes the Rufiji River system, which is the largest of the 9 basins. I've illustrated it here in dark blue. As 178,000 square kilometers in size, it's the largest basin of the country and around the size of the US state of Florida. It supplies a quarter of the country's renewable water resources, and nearly 60% of this basin is under some form of environmental protection, including internationally recognized protected areas. It's also, equally importantly, the core of the Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor for irrigation expansion, and now the site of construction of East Africa's largest hydropower scheme. Now, allocating environmental water is a values-based decision to share water within such a socio-ecological system as the Rufiji, with costs and benefits for different groups of people. And it's therefore important to understand the diverse value sets that are evident in any assessment. For the Rufiji Basin, participatory stakeholder consultations show that there are diverse, interested and affected groups of people beyond the high-level decision makers that have different values and objectives in mind for setting environmental flows. Many of these values are not mutually exclusive. For example, in the Rufiji, there were environmental values around the health of fish and biodiversity, economic values around finding lowest cost options and solutions, the most productive use of water, social values around equity and place cultural identity, and governance values around who should actually be involved in decisions about new water investments or policies. Now, national priorities, including for development and the wider context in which they are situated, influence environmental flow entry points and thus the potential for successful implementation. In Tanzania, the Tanzania National Water Policy and Water Resources Management Act give legal rights and priorities to the reserve. This reserve is the water for basic human needs, which receives highest priority above all other users of the resource, and then water for the environment as the second right by law, which is to protect the ecosystems that underpin the water resource base. In line with the wider regional development agenda, Tanzania has set ambitious targets for future development as well, the implications of which include substantial increases in water demand for wash, irrigation, industry, and energy. Now, knowledge of the current system of governance and management is essential, as is working within it. This includes understanding interrelated roles and responsibilities of different authorities and the supporting institutional framework for managing the resource. The water governance system in Tanzania extends from the Ministry of Water and Irrigation at the national level to the Rufiji and other basin water boards at the basin level, and the local level water users associations at the local level. Basin water boards, such as the Rufiji Basin Water Board, are mandated to put in place in every water body of interest a reserve and to make it operational, and they have to do this against a timeline. In the case of the Rufiji, that plan is already in place. The development of integrated water resource management and development plans for each basin is seen as a practical step towards being able to implement, monitor, and adaptively manage for the reserve. Different social and cultural dependencies on river flow regime exist in a river basin, and these also need to be importantly incorporated into the flow assessments. In the Rufiji environmental flow assessment, particular attention was paid to protecting the ecological functions that also provide ecosystem services to people. In this basin, communities that live along the various rivers are from different ethnic groups with different social cultural needs, and many of them are poor and vulnerable communities. Household subsistence livelihoods and local economic activities along the Kilombero River, which I've illustrated here, are dependent on a functionally intact and dynamic flow regime, particularly for flood recession agriculture, fishing, and livestock keeping. There are also other links to culture that may not be as easy to quantify, such as traditional farming practices in the Rufiji Delta or the use of the river for religious purposes. Now, it's vital that the environmental flow process continues beyond the stage of determining the environmental flow regimes to include subsequent planning and management steps. This enables us to analyze trade-offs and their implications, and in practice, to actually better optimize, monitor, and adaptively manage environmental flows. In the Rufiji Basin, there are some examples of these kinds of opportunities. Analysis of trade-offs in jointly meeting the needs of the reserve based on a recommended environmental flow regime and a future irrigation scenario actually led to the redesign of an irrigation scheme planned for a tributary of the Rufiji, the Luipa River. Simplified water allocation models have also been co-developed with the Rufiji Basin Water Board for the Kilombero and Great Ruaha subbasins to be used to evaluate individual water permit applications and to assess and plan for changes in water use demands of different water users, whether those users are domestic and industrial, small or large irrigators, or hydropower. And importantly, the model actually explicitly includes the reserve, has it in place, and allows for observations of changes to demand when it's monitored. Finally, it's important to make best use of the National Environmental Flow Guidance, guidelines and procedures that will influence what is actually appropriate and feasible in terms of the social process. Tanzania is applying a still evolving two-level approach according to purpose and the level of resource investment. It's supported by a new water resource classification and an emerging reserve monitoring system. This approach is being tested and locally adapted in the Rufiji and in other river basins in the country at the moment. At the first level, the approaches can be used, for example, to set precautionary abstraction limits to use in the development of basin planning scenarios. At the second level, more in-depth approaches are used to actively manage and hopefully in the future also scale up environmental flows based on social objectives for the future state of the river. In some parts of the Rufiji Basin, the objectives are around flow protection in less flow-altered rivers such as the Kilombero that I showed earlier. In other cases, it's around flow restoration in areas experiencing high water stress, where the over-allocation of water resources is leading to ecosystem degradation, as is in the case in the Great Ruaha Basin. Tailoring environmental flow processes according to these kinds of procedures helps ensure that environmental flow implementation takes place within an appropriate social decision context and follows that context as it evolves over time. Thanks very much. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Rebecca. That's always really interesting stuff. A reminder of the cultural importance of river management is something I always take when I'm listening to you, something that's been more and more front and center of my mind in recent years, and we've got a lot to learn about that. I also like the points you made a couple of times about adaptive management of environmental flows, and that's perhaps something we might return to in the discussion. Just a reminder to everybody listening, if you have questions for any of us speakers, please do use the chat box to write them down as you're listening. Of course, you can save them to the end as well. I think now we're going to move on to Mike McLean.
All right, thank you, Dave. I hope you see my screen all right.
Looks great.
Thank you. Let me move this. All right, well, we've already learned a lot about environmental flows, or E-flows, and I'll now present more on specific tools and measures to enable their incorporation into integrated water resources management, or IWRM. How do we do it? I'd like you to understand and consider E-flows to be one of the essential tools in the IWRM toolbox, and therefore an essential piece of the IWRM puzzle, which, as you can see, consists of many other tools and measures necessary to achieve sustainability. So let's quickly reflect on E-flow's unique contribution to IWRM. What problem does it tackle? IWRM is designed to address the multiple pressures facing water resources, like those addressed by the emergency recovery plan that Dave presented in his presentation. A big problem is pollution from agricultural, urban, industrial sources, and IWRM certainly includes tools to control pollution. Habitat destruction and fragmentation of aquatic ecosystems caused by development of infrastructure in rivers and drainage of wetlands, big problems, and IWRM has tools to address them. Overexploitation of resources like fisheries or sand and gravel is a problem, as are invasive species. And for each, IWRM has established tools and measures. Finally, there's the pressure, the problem of flow and level alteration, and E-flows are the IWRM tool to address it. All these tools and measures must, of course, be implemented in a coordinated fashion, and failure to employ any of them may impact the success of IWRM programs. For far too long, and still in many places, E-flows have not been properly considered, and IWRM programs have fallen short of their goals. So what's the plan? We heard a couple of references both in Dave's presentation, also in Rebecca's. IWRM takes shape in the form of river basin management plans. This is an example table of contents from one of the IWRM toolbox. It comes from the IWRM toolbox of the Global Water Partnership. The planning begins with assessment, generating knowledge about the characteristics and needs of the system to be managed. We see in the list the assessment of aquatic and terrestrial ecosystem needs. This is where the technical assessment of E-flows is carried out, now considering not only biota needs, but also the social and cultural dimensions presented by Rebecca. Knowledge from this assessment then feeds into the integrative process of defining measures and instruments to meet basin management goals and objectives. E-flow requirements are assessed using one of the methods you're already likely familiar with, but what specific measures and instruments can be used to implement them? Well, based on the visions and objectives of the basin plan and considering wider catchment management and the prescribed E-flow regime, there are a variety of measures and instruments that can be used to implement E-flows. The choices depend on the sources of hydrological alteration and the current political settings. When the resource is already overexploited or altered by many small influences, there are special measures that can be employed. But I'd like to focus on the widespread situation in which E-flows can be implemented through environmental water allocation mechanisms. These include caps on consumptive water use, license conditions on water users, conditions on storage operators, reserves, which you've already heard something about from Rebecca, and environmental water rights. I've grouped these mechanisms into those imposing conditions on the water user or operator, and those establishing a legal right to water for the environment. Each is an independent mechanism, but they often occur together in basin scale E-flows implementation. Conditions on storage operators are fairly clear to everybody, so I'll mention them only briefly in the next slide. I'll then consider the remaining four in tandem. First, looking at the combination of a cap on consumptive water use and environmental water rights in Australia, and then looking at the combination of license requirements on individual users and the ecological reserve in Southern and Eastern Africa. Implementation of E-flows for individual storage operators requires programming E-flow releases into dam operations. For new dams, required E-flow releases should be determined in the design phase, but in older dams, some modifications may be required to enable E-flow releases. Release of E-flows from dams delivers environmental water at specific points in the river, so it's also important to integrate dam-based measures into larger basin E-flows implementation. The information on the screen is for Nepean Dam in Australia. Note that not only does this dam include the release of E-flows as part of its operational rules, the information about the daily releases is also made available via the internet. The figures on the left are from the 2nd of December 2017 and indicate 16 million liters released as environmental flows. Figures for the past week and the past year are also indicated. So a cap is a limit placed on the total volume of water that may be diverted in a basin. In response to growing use and deteriorating ecological conditions in Australia's Murray-Darling Basin, in 1995, a cap was imposed on total water diversions. The figure on the right shows the cap management units and key controlling infrastructure in the basin. The annual variability of the cap and corresponding diversion levels are shown in the figure on the left. 2001 to 2009 was a decade of drought in the Murray-Darling Basin, which explains why there's a decreasing trend in the level of the cap. The cap sets a limit on diversions, which also protects a residual level of water in the basin that serves as a basic environmental flow. But this is a passive approach to protecting e-flows, and the cap set each year is not influenced by specific environmental objectives. To meet specific objectives, water managers need to acquire and actively manage environmental water side by side with other water users. So let's see how they do it. So in the Murray-Darling Basin, the environment has water rights just like other water users. But while other water rights are acquired by individuals and companies, the water rights of the environment are acquired by the Australian government on behalf of the environment. And decisions about releases are made by environmental water holders. In 2014-2015, surface water rights for environmental purposes amounted to about 25% of total water rights. Just like with any other user, objectives for environmental water use vary depending on conditions. The framework on the slide shows examples of environmental watering objectives under different climate conditions. Objectives are aligned with the functions of flow under similar natural conditions. During drought and dry conditions, protecting the aquatic system against critical ecological losses and catastrophes is prioritized. Under normal or average conditions, the priorities focus on recovery and improving ecological health and resilience. And during wet and very wet conditions, priorities are to enhance ecological processes and reconnect systems, especially floodplains and wetlands. This is an example of an environmental watering plan for the Loddon River in the state of Victoria. It consists of seasonal low flows, shown in blue, and freshes or high flows, shown in green. Each of these flow components has specific objectives attached to it. For example, the spring fresh has the objectives of providing for fish movement and breeding cues and maintaining channel form. This watering plan is developed with the input of waterway managers who propose local objectives based on their waterway strategies developed in consultation with the community and other partners. The environmental water holder for the state of Victoria will incorporate the objectives of the different waterways into a comprehensive watering plan, which is also coordinated with the plans of other states. The final mechanism giving the environment a legal right to water is the ecological or environmental reserve, also that Rebecca mentioned. This mechanism is used in Southern and Eastern Africa. It originates from the 1998 South African Water Act. At a planning level, the reserve is an objective-oriented water entitlement for the environment to ensure that water needed to protect aquatic ecosystems and meet basic human needs is set aside before allocations are made to other users. If you imagine a bucket representing the total long-term average volume of water in a basin, the reserve can be viewed as the volume protected for basic human needs and the environment. The reserve is set and protected in the process of water allocation planning, as Dave also referred to, which assesses first the total natural yield of a basin. It then quantifies and sets aside the reserve. And finally, it quantifies the water that's available for other users. And permission to use this water is then issued in the form of licenses and permits that we saw as one of the other widely applied mechanisms. So I hope after that you now see e-flows as a standard and essential tool in IWRM that work in concert with other tools to deliver sustainable water resources management. They address a pressure on water resources and ecosystems that no other tool addresses. They have a clear place in the planning process and established delivery mechanisms. They're quantifiable and they're implementable. And I hope you'll become one of those hot people or champions that Dave referred to and help us in implementation around the world. Thanks very much.
Mike, thanks. Great stuff. I felt like I was at university again in a good way. I was learning something.
There will be an exam at the end, will there not? I believe that Scott has something lined up.
Not quite a big exam, but I think Scott is lining up a poll. We'll
All
talk
right.
about it shortly. Good stuff. Okay, moving on in the interest of time. Our next speaker is Professor Qiuzhao Dong from the Institute of Water Resources and Hydropower Research in China. From my understanding, it's a really interesting time for environmental flows in China. The conversation is beginning seriously there about how to do environmental flows. So I'm very much looking forward to your presentation. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. Is that very clear of my voice and my slides?
Looks great.
Yeah, very clear.
Good night in my side, everyone. And I'm very pleased to join in the discussion about the environment flow. And thank you so much for the invitation from Scott and from Dr. Zhao. And my topic is about the research on the environment flow for the heavily modified river, a case study of the Huai River. My name is Xiaodong Qu from IWRM. For the content, it's totally including the 5 parts. So in this study, unlike the others, I'd like to give a very specific introduction about how did we use the biological communities of macroinvertebrate as indicators to study how to set up the relationship between the ecosystem needs and the hydrological environment flow. And the purpose of this study is major to set up the threshold values before we totally discussing about the environment flow management. So as you may know, streams are one of the most disturbed ecosystem in the world. So globally, the water resources development plays a key role in the loss of the aquatic biodiversity. And as you may know, the main reasons was recommended and calculated as water resources development. So for that part, the dam density, river fragmentation, consumption of the water loss, human water stress, and agricultural water stress are the main reasons. So last year, the mapping of the world free-flowing rivers showed that around more than, sorry, I need to, okay. More than 37% of the rivers longer than 1,000 kilometers remain free-flowing over their entire length in the world. So totally, in the whole world, there are about 2.8 million dams has been constructed. And in China, last year, the calculation number showed that more than 10,000 dams, mostly the large and middle-sized dams, have been constructed. So as we all may know, the rivers are exposed to sustained pressures from fragmentation and loss of the river connectivity, constraining their capacity to flow unimpeded, affecting many fundamental processes of the ecosystem, especially for the streams. The loss of the natural flow could adjust many aquatic organisms' compositions. So in this study, we selected the Huai River as one of the pilot study area. The Huai River is famous in China because of its higher number of dams construction. So the severe ecological damage and the disappearance of the sensitive species, especially for the native species, have been identified. So the river was strongly regulated below the dams. And the ecological flow is around 3% of the annual flow, which cannot meet the need of the ecological health development. And the things that for the upstream region of the Huai River, most streams are still free-flowing, but in the downstream part, a large number of dams have been constructed. So in this study, we select one of the tributaries, the Shaying River, as a pilot study area. And this river is very typical tributary of the Huai River basin. If you look at the right down figure carefully, all the red square show where is the dam constructed. So most of the tributaries and in the main stem, the dams was constructed for the flooding control and other purpose of the water resources. And also the Shanyin River spanned 10 cities with a drainage area of more than 36,000 kilometers square, and the mainstream length is about more than 560 kilometers long. The entire section of the Shanyin River is regulated by the construction of the dams. So in this study, the first thing we need to understand is which kind of aquatic organism is suitable for the indicators. So mostly the people use the fish and the riparian vegetations. But in this study, we selected the macroinvertebrate because in this kind of the macroinvertebrate, they are ubiquitous and have very higher species richness, more than fish. So we can have more complex community composition for identify the sensitivities of the hydrological indicators. And for the fish, because of the local peoples usually fishing for the food, so the macroinvertebrate we're thinking about, it will be more suitable indicators in this region. And unlike other researches, only use the species richness to reflect the biodiversity condition. And in this study, except that, we also using the functional feeding groups to reflect the efficiency of the material cycle. And we also use the habitat target groups to reflect how the species will shoot for different kind of regions of the rivers. And we all may know macroinvertebrate is a very important community and play an important role in sustaining the river ecosystem, and it could be a very good indicator for reflecting the river health. So in this study, we took the 2 years sampling in the whole basin of the Shanyin River, including the upstream and the downstream. So for each site, we collected around 11 samples per site. And the total sampling number is around, sampling site is around 52. And the macroinvertebrate indices, including like richness, diversity, were calculated. And for the functional feeding group, we based on the data collection condition, we selected the predator, filtering collectors, and the Garian collections, and others. For the habitat trait groups, we selecting the swimmer, climber, clinger, etc. And we also collected around 40 years hydrological data for the calculation of the IHA indicators. In the ungauged locations, we use the hydrological modeling simulation to calculate the hydrological indicators. And the hydrological indices, we're using the daily and the peak flow records by Hydrological Index 2. So for more sensitive identification of hydrological variation, we're using the method called DNA comparison method. So we wanted to find more sensitive indicators between the hydrological alteration and the biological indices. So it's matching the series of hydrological data with macroinvertebrate and finding the relationship that those, especially for those are significant, so the higher significance. And we also calculate the environment flow. So I would like to give a brief introduction about our result. So for the hydrological index alteration, more than half of IHA indicators will already be highly disturbed. That is very very predictable that by the construction of the dam, as showed that the one-day minimum flow, like 3 days minimum flow and the reversal rate, and the 7 days minimum flow and 0 days were the main hydrological disturbance indicators for the Shaying River. So by using the CCA method and the relationship, internal relationship analysis, we showed that the FFGs are mainly affected by 1 day maximum flow, and HDGs are mainly affected by 30 days minimum flow. And the biodiversity of the macroinvertebrate are mainly affected by the mean flows. So when we combine all of the informations together, as I showed here, as 1 day max increased, the filter percentage, the proportion of the filters decreased and then increased. That is very easily could be understand that because in the upper stream, there are a lot of the cleansers, they're using the fine particle the fine particle organic matters. And in the downstream, because of the increase of the sedimentation, so a lot of species like the crabs, sorry, not crabs, it's the organisms like the clumps can filter the fine organic matters. And also the 1 day max increased, the creeper increased and then decreased. So in this region, we thought because of the crops, we thought it will be very suitable indicator because it could predict the proportion of the fine particle organic matters for food, and it also use the suitable proportion of the sand for the habitat. And for the HTGs, we using the 30 days minimum as the most significant indicator. We found the swimmers percentage significantly positively increased with the increase of the 30 days minimum increase. And for the 30 days increased, the sprawler increased and then decreased. So I would like to give a brief explanation about this, about the swimmers. Like the swimmers is very easily affected by the flow. So this kind of species, they have to find a way to shoot the flow environment. So in the upper stream, they will using the flow as a drift and gradually moved to the downstream part and to be adult, and they flying back to the upper stream part to set up the eggs. So I think that is why the swimmer will increase with 30 days minimum. So when we combine all of the relationship together, we based on the theory of river continuum, the suitable composition of the different FFGs and HTGs were recommended. So it's also indicated the reverse of the Atlantic ecosystem and the Lotic ecosystem. So besides that, we also have set up the principles for design the ecological flow for Huai River. So firstly, we think it's very important we should restore the river ecological restoration. That will be, we need to maximum the ecological potential because of it is already a disturbed and degraded river. So the second, we want to get up the minimum disturbance factor. So that means the higher ecological integrity. So thirdly, we also thinking about the adaptation of the local condition. So for the guarantee the infraction of the social development. So based on that, we set up the objective function to get the maximize the river ecological services. That means we should set up suitable macroinvertebrate community structure. And we also set up the suitable hydrological disturbance index, and also set up consider the humans' demands for the social development. So based on that, we set up the final environment flow. I didn't show all the results because we just finished the first two parts. And currently we are trying to put the social demands together to set up the environment flow for the Huai River. So for the conclusion part, I thought it's still difficult to select the potential or suitable protection target for any aquatic ecosystem, especially in China with a very higher level of human disturbances. And in this study, we showed that FFG is an alternative method and worked well in the Huai River, but we didn't expand this kind of method to the other rivers. So how would it be suitable for different type of weather streams? We didn't know that yet. And the environment flow is important for the ecosystem restoration. However, it needs to coordinate the water resources use from social needs gradually. I think even we could calculate very great or very sensitive and very accurate numbers of the environment flow, we have to think about how to adjust the water demand for the social development and the humans. And the result highlight the importance of maintaining the natural characters of the regulated rivers. And we are monitoring the FFGs and STGs restoration in the Siam River currently, and I hope we could get more methods. So finally, I'd like to share a picture about why a lot of people ask me why you using the macrointerpret for the indicators. So yes, we are working for the ecosystem, but pretty soon we want to the ecosystem will work for us. Thank you very much. That's all.
Thank you, Professor Chiu. I love that last slide. And some really interesting themes coming out there, some proper ecology, and in particular around the question of how you choose indicators so that we can monitor changes in ecosystem health as a result of environmental flow implementation, and how we do that in very heavily regulated systems. I think is a very relevant challenge. Okay, time moves on. Move now to our last speaker, Dr. Zhao from GIWP, the General Institute of Water Resources and Hydropower Planning. Dr. Zhao is an old friend from China. I know he has been immersed in thinking about how to do environmental flows at the national level in China over the last couple of years. So I'm going to be fascinated to see what lessons he can share from that. Dr. Zhao,
thank you, Dave. This slide is clear?
Yeah, you're on presenter view at the moment. I don't know if there's a way of taking that off so that you can put it on full screen.
它是这个显示器上面来的。它显示器。
哦，你这个咋弄？对。
我们的这个知道啊，这是。这样行，但是它这个看到。放一个只要。Okay, is that okay? Dave?
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dave, and thank you for the invitation to this webinar. And since this time in Beijing is 9 o'clock at night, so I will give a very quick presentation about some source and practice of the environment flow requirement assessment in China. And the former experts show many good thoughts about the environment flow, and very agree with these ideas, especially the Professor Chu just said in his last slide that the environmental flow must be coordinated with the water use from the social needs. Since China has experienced rapid economic development in the last decades, along with the rapid development, the water use for the social needs is also increased directly. So we have met many serious water issues. So this presentation is more focused on our national level, because in this development period, we must to balance the water resource between the ecosystem and our social development. So we don't have many waters left in the river. So we must to consider more about the national level, how to balance these two parts. So this presentation is tell some national level thoughts how to balance these two sides. Today's presentation contains these three parts. First, I will very quickly give some brief introduction about the issues and challenges. First is about some current situations of the water resources in China. As you can see from these figures, we have many quantity about the water resource, but the characteristics of the water resource in China has these three parts. First is the uneven distribution, and the second is the mismatch between water and productivities, and third is fragile water-related ecosystems. For the first one is the uneven distribution. You can see that many waters in the spring and summer, and less waters in the autumn and the river, and the variations of river runoffs between dry and wet years could reach 2 to 6 times annually. So these uneven distributions must to ask us to how to set the aim of the environmental flow is very difficult. And the second is the mismatch between water and productivities. You know that in China, we don't have many good lands to development. Many people, many productivities are located in the east, especially in the northeast, in the north of the China. And the water in the north is not very much. So this mismatch between the water and the productivities make the water issues seriously, especially in some north of China, especially in Haihe rivers, that we have the serious water issues that every rivers don't have many waters left in there. So the environmental flows aimed in these rivers is hard to set and hard to guarantee. And the third characteristics is the fragile water-related ecosystems. This picture shows the fragile degrees of the China, and you can see the yellow parts is the fragile, and more than 60% of our nation's areas is very fragile. So when we meet these characteristics of the water resources, when we do the environmental flow, we must to meet these challenges. First is the significant reductions in the in-stream e-flows. As I just mentioned, we have over abstractions the waters from the rivers, so we don't left much waters in the rivers. So in some rivers we hard to decide the aim of the e-flows aims. The second challenge is the significant impact on the natural runoff patterns. As just the Professor Chu said, we built many dams in the rivers. The dams change the runoff regimes, and it's hard to decide when how to set the environment flow aims. The third challenge is the significant change in the downstream habitants. It's just mentioned by Professor Trees. And so these challenges of the ecological flow requirement assessment in China has these 4 parts. First the water requirements by rapid socio-economic growth. As I just mentioned, in these last decades, China has experienced rapid economic development, and in the future, China will also rapid development. So the water use for the social parts is increased. It makes the conflict between the ecosystem and the social is serious. And the second challenge is the water requirements by fragile ecosystem and the restorations. We have many rivers series as we have to protect and to do some river restoration. So this river restorations needs water, but we don't have many waters. So we need to find more waters from the social paths to the ecosystems, but it's hard to balance. The third challenge is unevenly spatial and temporal distribution of the water resources. This is I just mentioned the uneven distributions make some time, some period, and some regions it's hard to guarantee the environmental flows in the rivers. And the last challenge is the significant change in water resource environment. So we must answer these three questions. First is how to balance water requirements by human and nature. The second is how to set proper environmental flow requirement criteria for different river basins and regions. As I just mentioned, the rivers in China from different areas, from different regions, have met different issues, have different characteristics of the river, of the runoff regimes. So so it's hard to set general criteria. We must to set different criteria for different rivers. And the last question is how to allow the environmental flow requirement criteria suitable for the future situations. As the social economy is also development, the water use for the human, for the social is also increased. How we balance these future needs and also the needs for the ecosystems. So the second part is when we meet these challenges, how we do the environmental flows in China on our national level. First, we set concepts of the environmental flow requirement in China. We set the system of environmental flow requirement into two levels. The first is the basic environmental flow requirement. The second is optimal environmental flow requirement. The basic level is to set the baseline that we must to maintain a river ecosystem exists. If we broke the basic level, that means the river is dead. And we also to set an optimal level because we must to also set aim to control the water use for the social, for the humans. That's the two levels can be seen as a bridge between the ecosystem and the social. So these two levels can be balanced towards to these two paths. And the basic environmental flow requirement is the minimum in ecological flow and the procedures in rivers, lakes, and marshlands to maintain the ecological environment functions of the specific eco-environmental protection objects. As I just mentioned, the definition, and the optimal means a good status. And these pictures show the relationship with these different levels. The bottom line is we call the ecological base flow. It means the baseline is a fundamental base of the environmental flow. And the second level is we call the basic ecological flow. This basic ecological flow is just a process along with the runoff regimes of the year. And the basic ecological flow contains some sensitive ecological flow. That means for some months, for some periods, some fish, some plants needs a specific water flow process. This must be considered in the basic ecological flow. And the second level is we call the optimal environment flow. That means if we keep the environmental flow in this level, is the optimal status for the ecosystems. And then we draw some principles of the environmental flow requirement assessment. First, the environmental flow assessment is not purely scientific issues, especially in China, as I just mentioned, because in this development period, China must to balance the ecosystem needs and the human needs. And environmental flow in some rivers in China is not just scientific issues, not just to consider the fish needs, but we must to consider these two sides balance. So it's not just the purely scientific issues. It's mainly about scientific and the political issues. And second, the environmental flow requirement is results of the multiple trade-offs. This is also just, I think it's Michael Source. He just said that environmental flow requirement must consider different stakeholders, must consider different issues. So in China, the environmental flow requirement is also a result of these multiple trade-offs. And third, the principle is that the environmental flow requirement is specifically spatial and temporal results. We must to consider the river in different regions, in different time periods to set the different criteria. And the last principle is that the environmental flow requirement should be directly along with the water resource management measures. This is just Michael said that environmental flow is a tool in the water resource management. Especially in China, the environmental flow is a very good and very key tools in our nations about the water resource management. Our ministry has just set documents up about how we combine the environmental flow management into the water resource management. That our minister says the environmental flow is the first and the fundamental issues in the water resource management systems. So we also draw a hierarchies of the environmental flow requirement assessment in China. It contains three tiers. First is we must to set some cross sections in the rivers, and then we must to coordinate the upstream and downstream to maintain streams and tributaries, adjust the environmental flow of sections, and determine the flow of river systems. And also, at last, we must to put the environmental flow of the cross section into a whole basins to make this whole river basins is as a systems. And also, we also draw some specific principles about the environmental flow assessment. First, we must to respect the natural law of the water ecosystems. We must to consider the runoff regimes and some ecosystems structures and some ecosystems functions. So this is fundamental law to determine how we set the criteria. And second principle is highlight the demand for the ecological protections. That our nations just say a strategy we call the ecological stabilization. This strategy says that we must to put the ecosystem as the first stage. We must to protect our nation, our rivers, our forestry, our lands. So when we set the criteria, when we do the environmental flow assessment, we must to consider the ecological protections as the first stage. And the third is that we must to overall plans for water allocations. The water allocations is tools to make the environmental flow criteria into implementations. And last, we must to be realistic, reasonable, and feasible, because the runoff is a process, is dynamic, is uncertainty. So the aim and the criteria of the environmental flow requirement must be realistic. It's not just the one numbers. Maybe it's precise numbers. And last, we just quickly introduce some methods and procedures. And the methods we know that we call the hydrological methods, the hydrologic methods and habitat methods. The habitat methods is just the process the tree set in the Huai rivers. It's a good and useful method. But in China, we in many rivers we don't have so many data. We don't have many data. We usually use the hydrological methods for to calculate. But as I just mentioned, the different areas, the rivers in different areas in China has different characteristics. So we divided the rivers into these 5 regions. Is from the northeast cold areas, the Huang, Huai, Hai, sub-humid areas, is and the eastern humid areas, and northwest inland areas, and the Qinghai, Tibet, plateau. These 5 areas have different criteria to set the environment flow criteria. Besides the zonations, we also do some classifications of the rivers based on the size, the degree of the development and utilizations, and the engineering control capacities. We divided this our rivers into 6 grades. When the rivers, when the more larger of the rivers, maybe we can set more higher criteria. When the engineering control capacity is strong, we also can set a good criteria, because we have this capacities to support, to guarantee some environment flow in some dry seasons. And these tables shows in our nations, we give some recommended environment flow threshold or the criteria range in China. You can see this from the different areas, from different classifications. And also this threshold is just a range, because you can, when we do a specific rivers, we can choose specific numbers according to the rivers large, the size, the areas. And when we draw these tables, we can draw a general criteria that we can use these tables to do the environment flow management in our national levels, and to incorporate with our water resource management. And that is the presentation. Thank you for your listening.
Dr. Xiao, thanks very much. Fascinating stuff. It's no small challenge trying to use a coherent approach for environmental flow assessment and implementation in a country the size of China. So I don't envy you the challenge. I liked a couple of the points that you've particularly flagged up around the challenges of spatial and temporal variation. And I think you emphasized the point that's been implicit in several of our presentations, that this isn't a purely scientific challenge. There are other dimensions to it as well. Now, I'm conscious of time. We have overrun, for which apologies. We were planning to have a little poll for the people who are still listening in, and it looks like there are still quite a few people listening in, which is great. But Scott, I think maybe we cut that poll and move straight to Q&A. Does that sound sensible?
That would be good.
Good. Now, I have been keeping an eye on the chat box. I haven't seen questions coming in. I don't know if I'm keeping an eye on the wrong bit of it.
You want to be in the question box, not the chat box.
Ah, the question box.
There are some excellent questions this week.
Oh, good. Well, I can't see them, Scott. Where is the question box?
Ah, I thought we had discussed this earlier.
Yes, apologies. I'm struggling to find it now. Let me just... Where do I see the question box again? Do remind me. Apologies for this, folks.
Should we all see it theoretically? Because I also don't see anything labeled questions.
Can you see it now? I made a small change.
I can, yes. Let me just.
Excellent. Good.
Good. Thank you very much. Okay. So lots of reactions. One of them actually chimes with one of the questions I was going to flag to the panels, and a couple of times we've touched on this, Rebecca in particular, and I think it's a challenge for all of us. So there's a question from Sergio Salinas Rodriguez from Mexico, asking us how we reflect on incorporating climate change into environmental flows framework. So Rebecca talked about the challenges of adaptive planning and adaptive decision making. I think Mike has touched on that. It's been implicit in some of what Dr. Zhao said as well. So I guess the question to the panel would be if you had any tips for encouraging environmental flow assessment and implementation frameworks that could be adaptive to future changes in climate or indeed in other considerations. How would you recommend people go about that? And maybe in the first instance, well, Rebecca, seeing as you flagged it a little bit in your presentation, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, and maybe we'll open it up to other panelists.
Thanks, Sergio, for that question. Using the Tanzanian example, climate change is explicitly integrated in planning and management, including with environmental flows. So, for example, the adopted basin management plan for the Rufiji Basin, which looks at trends in water resources over time and looks at projecting those out in terms of future demands, it explicitly includes both climate change projections into those assessments and from the best available climate models at the appropriate scale, and the environmental flow recommendations for different classes of condition. So there is there's a use of the best available climate models inclusion into the water resources projections along with the environmental flows. So it's never a separate assessment. The two are put together. The same applies at the level of management. I think a couple of the challenges are around whether there's an understanding about how the river ecosystems will change. For example, studies in other parts of the world have shown that the types of rivers, we talked about classifying rivers in China of different types, that those types can actually change or are already changing with changes in climate. And I think one of the important things is to bear that in mind when setting flows for different types of system. Are those systems already changing from being, for example, snowmelt dominated to rainfall dominated, or from high dependency on base flows from groundwater to a different kind of system. So at the same time, those challenges are not just from the hydrological side or the climate side, but they're also from the ecological side, because we know ecosystems are also shifting and are dynamically responding to climate change already. So I think it's being aware of the shifts in the hydrology. It's no longer stationary. The shifts in ecosystems, the shifts in water resources in relation to climate, the social decisions around how to deal with climate change, and making sure all of those factors are as explicitly as possible integrated into the development plans or into the management and allocation processes. The last thing I'll say is that I think including estimates of risk and assurance to supply, for example, on agricultural water or hydropower, we can also think about including risks of assurance around environmental flows that pertain more explicitly to the projections around climate change, whether those are dry season projections or flood projections.
Thanks, Rebecca. I'm interested to go to our Chinese colleagues as well, Professor Chu and Dr. Zhao. To what extent in China, as you're doing the science on environmental flows and considering the frameworks for implementation, to what extent are you able, or are you actually incorporating considerations about climate change and other future changes? Dr. Zhao, maybe you go first, and then Professor Chu.
Okay,
I will be.
Thank you, Dave.
Yeah.
I saw that the climate change in China is very serious, and according to the third national census about the water resource, we just doing is that the results shows that in the some north of China, especially some northwest of China, in Xinjiang province, in Beijing, Tianjin, and Hebei province, the climate change has a significant change the runoff patterns, the runoff regions of the rivers, and in some north of the China, according to the new data, the water resources is less than 30% of the some old ones, and in the northwest of the China, in Xinjiang province, and the water resources increased. So when we do these areas, when we do the water resource, when we set the environment flow criteria in these areas, rivers, we must consider this climate change results. So we, in the north of China, in some rivers, the criteria we set much lower than a normal status, and in the Xinjiang province, we consider the water resource increase. We can set in some rivers, we can set a less higher criteria. That is why how we treat the environment flow in the climate change status.
Thank you. Professor Chu, anything you wanted to add on this?
Yes. From my personal experiences, I think the climate change will gradually change a lot of how can I say, the basic series of the stream ecology. And during the past 50 years, several very classic series, such like the river continuum, predicted the distribution of the biodiversity in the river system. Then with under the effect of the climate change, how could we predict the variation of the ecosystem along with the new weather types, the rainfall types, and will directly affect how could we set up a suitable management target for the environment flow. So from my personal experiences, I think it's very considerable topic. As one of my study region, the stream experiences a very severe flooding in 1 year, and we monitor the river more than 15 years. So we experienced the flooding before, and we found that mostly the community of the macroinvertebrate will be recovered around 2 or 3 months later. But after that very severe flooding, the community could not recover to the pre-flooding station around 3 years totally. So we wondering why the flooding is so strong and why the community is so weak, and maybe that is one of the great effect of the climate change, and especially in this year, the unpredictable rainfall in the middle of the China will also cause a very severe, very negative effect on the ecosystem. So that is what I thought we should continually focus on the long-term monitoring of the ecosystem, especially for the aquatic ecosystem. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very sensible response. There are all sorts of challenges for how we secure the resources and commitment to long-term monitoring, but for sure it's needed. Scott, if we have time, I'd just like to go to one other question, and apologies to other people who's.
Yes, please do. And what we can do is send the questions to our panelists and then post the responses on our website, www.iwra.org, along with the recording and the PowerPoints. So that way everyone's questions can be answered and our panelists all have a chance to respond to the questions, because these are really good questions this time.
Yeah, no, there's some really good ones in there. The one other I'd like to do, and I'm going to slightly sort of Oh, I'm going to pick the theme of the question, but not sort of ask the question verbatim, from Martina Bussettini. She's asked a question around geomorphology and environmental flows, and I don't think any of us really touched on that explicitly in our presentations, but certainly one of the things we see in a lot of rivers is really big implications for sediment flows, for sediment deposition, for habitat formation, as a result of changing sediment flow conditions. So, and Mike, I'll start with you on this one, but then open it up to others on the panel. To what extent do you think sediment flows are sufficiently taken account of, both in environmental flow assessment, but also in the development of regulations and frameworks for implementation of environmental flows?
Well, as far as environmental flow assessment goes, it's fundamental. It is the geomorphology of the river is the template on which the habitats that we seek to preserve are developed. And the modifications in the geomorphology that is independent of flow alteration creates this disconnect where it does require multiple tools, multiple approaches in order to address the problem. And of course, the effectiveness and the efficiency of the different approaches are incredibly different as well. So that's why, you know, all of these questions, including the climate change, they have to be kept in the context of full integrated water resources management and not addressed in isolation. It's important that we have these discussions and we understand the linkages between them. But when it comes to the management process itself, it all needs to be pulled together and considered integratively. And of course, our ability to mobilize sediments downstream in highly regulated systems that are highly fragmented systems, you know, that's a technology that an engineering technology that's extremely challenging, extremely expensive, and not yet showing a real effectiveness on the level of other approaches. So it's something we should never disregard, and I appreciate Martina bringing it up in the discussion. And we've got a lot more work to do on it.
One of my perceptions, and I don't know if this is fair or not, so feel free to disagree, is that actually there are all sorts of environmental flow assessment methodologies which are pretty good on incorporating considerations around sediment and geomorphology and habitat formation. But when it comes to implementation, a lot of implementation falls under the auspices of water resource management departments or ministries, and at least in some parts of the world, the emphasis in that discipline, in water resource management, is very much on the water as a resource from a system. And some of those issues around geomorphology perhaps aren't considered as much. Do you think I'm being fair on that? And I guess that's a question to anybody on that.
Let me give a very quick and somewhat anonymous example that this morning I was in a conference call for multiple hours working towards the development of an approach to environmental flows in a particular country that we're collaborating with. And the authority in that country asked us to please just consider velocity and depth in our considerations of the needs of habitats and the like. And that's because they are the water authority, and that's what they have control over. So that is the only aspect of the system that they saw themselves as managing and influencing, and they asked us to narrow our assessment methodology to the point that they only needed to measure those variables. So there's one example of where we stand, and they're saying that for very practical and real reasons as well, but we know that we can't simply disassociate those and not consider them together.
Thanks. Anybody else on the panel want to contribute on that? Or has Mike captured it? I see silence. Okay. I think maybe we'll wrap it up. There was one other question that I just wanted to very briefly answer from Nicole Chabanet, who asked about how e-flows are being applied in, well, she was talking in particular about the national implementation of the Convention on Biological Diversity and UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Commitments. To an extent, perhaps, particularly with CBD, and I would argue perhaps with SDGs, SDGs are slightly better, I think there is a real gap there. We considered that a little bit in the bioscience paper that we published earlier this year on the emergency recovery plan for freshwater biodiversity. I think there's a real problem at the international level in these conventions with considering water flows as a key indicator of environmental health and sustainable development. So we have a bit of work to do on that as well. But I won't dwell on it further because I'm very conscious of time. So maybe we draw the Q&A session to a close here. And Scott, I'll hand back to you for some final remarks.
Well, again, like I said, thank you for your great moderation, David. That was really good. And as I said to everyone in the audience, what we'll try to do here is send all the questions over to our panelists to respond in written form, and then we can post those responses on the internet on our website, www.iwra.org, along with the recording of this webinar and the PowerPoint presentations. We'll get those up as soon as we can. Probably get the recordings up and the PowerPoints up earlier, and then maybe it'll take a little while for the panelists to respond and we'll get the questions up. It gives a couple of weeks and we'll have everything up there and you can check back. Really appreciate everyone's great questions this week. So I would again like to thank the panel. Thank you so much to David Tickner, Chief Freshwater Advisor at WWF and excellent moderator. Rebecca Tharm, Director of River Futures and a Fellow at LE Stadium. Michael McLean, Chair, Professor of Ecohydrology at the IHE Delft Institute for Water Education. Jiadong Qiu, Professor of Engineering, China Institute of Water Resources and Hydropower Research. And Jiadong Zhao, Deputy Division Chief, General Institute of Hydropower and Water Resources Planning and Design, Ministry of Water Resources of the People's Republic of China. This webinar was really pushed forward by the China group, so we appreciate their support and help on this, bringing everyone together and making sure we had such a great event. We really appreciate that insight that we got from you guys. I know that some of our panel and IWRA is on Twitter, so please go ahead and look up our panel and follow them if you are interested. And if any of these presentations left you interested in learning more, you can go to our LinkedIn webpage and continue the discussion and follow us on LinkedIn as well. I would encourage everyone to check out our website, like I said earlier, at www.iwra.org, where you can find a variety of our policy briefs, our past webinars, and look into some of other material that we produce, such as the Water International, our flagship journal. I hope that everyone found the insights provided by the panel during the special event to be really helpful. Gave everyone a lot of material to think about and work with in the coming days, and it's building a lot of creativity for your work. To remind everyone, this is a webinar brought to you by the International Water Resources Association. We are an almost 50-year-old nonprofit, non-governmental educational organization. We focus on bridging disciplines and geographies and connecting professionals, students, individuals, corporations, institutions, everyone who's concerned with becoming with the sustainable use of the world's water resources. So if you're interested in learning more about the association or becoming a member, because we are member supported, so we'd love to have membership as well. We are in a membership drive right now. So please go to www.iwra.org. So on behalf of the whole IWRA office, thank you so much for tuning in and watching the webinar today. Thanks.
Thanks. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.